All right. I end up voting negative in this debate round on the capitalism critique. There's a couple of things, one second, sorry, that I think that needs to be answered. Well, I think the major thing is that you need to have more offense against capitalism and not just defense. Like, your arguments are capitalism's inevitable and a permutation. Capitalism being inevitable doesn't mean that we should go ahead and perpetuate capitalism, especially when in both the block and the 2NR, there's reading and then extending evidence that indicates that the first step to come up with alternatives to capitalism is to reject it, so as for us to then be able to move away so that there are alternatives that are possible. There's evidence that you can read where it's just saying a straight up rejection of capitalism without an alternative to move to will create transition wars because people won't know what's going on and they'll just fight amongst each other and just have a quick power grab. So you should turn your capitalism inevitable into something more offensive that, given the way that this is how history has always been constructed, if we don't continue to utilize it and we just say no, what'll end up happening is that we'll just people will go crazy and they'll run away and they'll start going to war with one another, right? And then that becomes more of an offensive argument. Otherwise, if capitalism, even if it's not the root cause of everything, if capitalism is what gives way to exploitation and the adverse element, the impacts of your act are based upon exploitation through capitalist systems, such as the way that people are sort of forced to sell their bodies or are victimized as a result of the way that the prostitution discourse goes down, which seems to be very much linked into capitalism, then that's something that the critique would be able to solve for us and move away from that. And then there's a risk that there might be other impacts. And I think that the 2NR should do more impact work explaining why capitalism is bad outside of the internal impacts of the affirmative. Like, what are the external impacts of the capitalism critique, right? And there's a million different impacts to capitalism. Most of the time it ends in extinction through environmental destruction or through war or something like that. So that way you'd be like, even if it doesn't solve the K, we have an extinction, or the app, we have an extinction scenario. And I think that that'd be beneficial. If you're gonna have a permutation, you need to have a net benefit to the permutation, and you do in the 2AC. It's a piece of evidence that indicates that we need piecemeal reforms, that we have to move away from capitalism step by step, which makes that situation better, which means that even if the permutation still links, it's better to use the permutation than a total outright rejection, because the only way we can dismantle capitalism is take steps against that system, right? And that's the analysis that's in the card, but it's not the analysis that's in the 1AR or the 2AR. And that's, again, how that permutation, instead of just being like, hey, we could theoretically do these things together, becomes offense, because then we should do them together because the ways in which prostitution links to capitalism is beneficial, i.e., prostitutes use capitalism against itself, right? It's people who are forced into prostitution or choose prostitution are utilizing cracks within the system of capitalism to gain money, to get empowerment from that money in order to utilize their bodies in ways that capitalism says traditionally you should not be able to, right? So it's a pretty strong argument in relation to prostitution for why this instance of utilizing capitalism against itself can be beneficial, and I think that that would make a much stronger permutation ground that you could then leverage against everything else. Now, I do think that there's a large chance that you would have made these arguments, if the capitalism was the first thing that you went to, opposed to being the last, 45 seconds of your speech, right? Because at that point, all you could do is just a quick, shoddy extension of each of your arguments, opposed to getting into the warrants of your arguments. And a cross-examination sort of throughout the debate, it seems like you've got a grasp of the arguments, but then when you get to it in the actual debate, it's sort of like some of that analysis just sort of flows away, which makes it, problematic. And so I think that hunkering down your offense would be beneficial, and it's not bad, right? Most people are going to say prostitution is capitalist, right? You're forcing people are selling their body to make money. It seems capitalist, seems exploitative. To read evidence indicates that capitalism is a good thing, right? Capitalism can be empowering. And the other thing you can do with the Prostitution Act is you can point out the logic of their links, that prostitution is exploitative because people are selling their bodies, assumes that the people who choose to go into prostitution are duped by the system of capitalism and are exploiting themselves, right? So that capitalism, K, in the instance of your affirmative, is that re-victimization narrative that you're criticizing, right? Oh, these people who are prostituted are just manipulated by the system of capitalism, don't know what they're doing, so they end up in exploitative situations where they prostitute their bodies. Your argument is very clearly, no, the prostitutes who are choosing to do this are seen as avenues of sexual empowerment and class empowerment that's able to radically reconfigure that sort of relationship. For you to just say capitalism exploits them flattens that narrative into just another narrative of victimization that you're wanting to see criticized, right? So your affirmative is built-in offense against that critique that you're not really leveraging very well. And I think that offense is also what will allow that permutation to become much stronger, because then the piecemeal reform is good, step by step is good, and gives sex workers that ability to use capitalism against itself in an empowering way, opposed to just calling them victims yet again, because of the capitalist system, right? Now you have a very strong situation for the offense against their linked story and a permutation that's going to go ahead and be able to solve it. And I think that that would be a very good way to sort of approach it. I do want to say that in relation to midterms, it is dropped in the 1NR and the 2NR. You can't say, quote, extend all of our evidence, they don't have warrants, so you could just extend them all. That's the 1NR. And the 2NR can't say, we extended it all because she said, quote, extend all of our evidence and there was no warrants on their side, right? That doesn't tell me the link, doesn't tell me the impact, doesn't tell me the uniqueness, right? Now, you could win that debate. I don't think the arguments are particularly strong, but you don't commit any time to that debate. So all you're doing is wasting your time in the couple of seconds that you do there. You actually have to flesh out those arguments a little more. And I say that because that's not the only place in the debate where you say, quote, extend all of our arguments, it answers all of those that don't have warrants, right? And so, like, you come very close to losing this debate in the 2NR because you aren't necessarily warranting out a lot of your arguments. You're just sort of extending your arguments. You don't need to read a card in the 2NR either on the it's inevitable debate. You read, where's my cancel? You read 1, 2, 3, 4 cards. Answering inevitable in the negative block. So you do not need a 5th card in the negative block. What would be more preferable to me is to have you have time explaining any one of those cards, opposed to, quote, we have Zizek, Breck, and Deleuze, extend all of them, right? And so, like, any one of them spending, you know, the extra 10 seconds explaining it, that would get your speaker points up and would also make me a lot more comfortable voting on that, right? But I think that because the 2AR doesn't do enough work on the argument, sort of explaining that as well, your lack of analysis doesn't lose you the round. But in the world where the 2AR collapses to those arguments and warrants them out, it could very easily lose you the round. And that's sort of the situation in a lot of these sort of flows, is that after the 2NR, I was pretty sure I was going to vote AF. After the 2AR, I ended up voting neg because each speech was just lacking warrants in the appropriate spots to sort of, you know, to win the round. And I think that if you all slow down, and by slow down I don't mean speak slower, I mean think slower and implicate your arguments more fully, then it'll be better, opposed to just sort of running through, I need these 5 arguments. All of you need to think, what's the one argument I need to win the round? Spend the majority of your time doing that. I tell my debaters 3, 2, 1. 3 minutes on one argument, 2 minutes on a secondary piece of offense, and 1 minute play defense. Rough analysis, like, obviously you have to play it by ear, but the point is that, like, half of your speech should be winning one major piece of offense and then leveraging that piece of offense against everything else in the round. So you're winning victimization. Take that victimization argument and weigh that against capitalism and spend 30 seconds weighing victimization against their capitalism scenario, right? And then utilize that while talking about the permutation, opposed to winning victimization and then going to the permutation and then going to the other sort of stuff, is that there's not a coherent story that comes out of the 2AR that gives me a single piece of offense that I can vote on in the world that they win, a capitalism link and the impact. But you could lose that link and impact if you did that impact analysis, right? And so I think that it's true on the other side. It's like assume that they win their victimization, now weigh your capitalism impact against that, right? And so you always want to answer the best version of the argument. And so assume that the other team wins 100% of their impact claim and say, even if you give them 100% of this, we'll still win the debate round because of, and then insert your impact claims. And then you've done that impact comparison, and then you could be like, but they're not going to win 100% because, and then do your defense, right? Both teams sort of prioritize their defense in the round, reasons for why you don't lose. And that's important, but reasons why you don't lose won't win you a debate round. What will win you the debate round is the offense that you want to leverage against everything else within the round. So, yeah, so those are my suggestions. I also think that the 2AC, you come dangerously close to dropping a lot of the arguments that they put on the case debate, because they have a lot of different reasons why legalization will be bad, and you spend a long time just sort of giving a story of your affirmative that's uncontested. It'd be better if you gave that story of the affirmative while answering their argument. So it'd be like, they say the status quo is best. First, decriminalization and legalization is always on the table, and that is not the status quo that they're referring to, which means that we're moving in a negative direction. The only option is to move it in a positive direction. Second, our Houdra evidence explains how we move it into a positive direction that our affirmative doesn't. Now, their second argument is legalization will increase street prostitution. That's not true because, you know, explain your victimization stuff, right? So that way you're telling the story, but you're doing it in a way that answers it, opposed to spending like the first 3.5 minutes of your speech just explaining your story and then answering their stuff with like, no, it doesn't solve fast. No, legalization works, right? You're just giving a couple of word answers, even though the block of text that you say at the top does answer everything they're saying. You're not doing that interaction. So if you tell the story as you're answering arguments, it's going to be a lot stronger. And in the negative block, you should hash out the things that are distinct and nuanced and explain, like, this trafficking turn does not rely on the internal links that our other evidence relies upon. That means that their arguments aren't really responsive to it. Otherwise, what happens is what the 2AC slip-up doesn't get capitalized on because it suddenly just turns into legalization good-bad debate. But you had nuanced arguments for why legalization is bad for different reasons, but you aren't explaining why those reasons are different as the round goes on, which means that it simplifies the debate in a debate that you want to essentially make it more complex and nuanced to be able to get at those elements of it within the round. So those are my overall comments. I think that in regards to narratives, I think that they're ahead on the narrative debate because I think that they're like the argument that yours is specific to race and they're not, and is something that's not responded to. I don't know if it's true. If it is true, then they have more specific evidence. And I also don't think they're using totalizing narratives that necessarily try and create an essentialized vision the way that you want it to be. So I would give them the spot of the narrative stuff, but it's just that the capitalism ends up solves for the majority of the after moving away and rejecting capitalism. Anybody have any questions?
Yeah. How could we better split up the neg block? What do you think we do?
You don't need. You had a minute left over, which means you could have taken You could have taken the case debate, or you could have taken midterms. You could have done the critique and something else, right? So that way your partner didn't have to do everything.
Right. So take a little more time on it.
Take more, yeah, because there wasn't that much on the critique, so there wasn't 9 minutes for you to talk about there. So if you took, the critique and say narratives, or the critique and the case debate works well because your case debate sort of explains how prostitution is exploitative, which means that it works well with your capitalism argument. And then she could take, the midterm debate, the narrative debate, and the soft power, right? And I think that would be fair.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Any questions?
You pretty much I don't know. You answered all of it. I see all the things I did wrong. Things that definitely need to be improved upon.
Okay, well that's good then. So don't make the same mistakes again.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, good debate, everyone.
Yeah,
All right.